Do you think you know the God of the Bible? The image of a loving and forgiving God may be very familiar to many, but there is another side of God described in the Old Testament that is unsettling for many modern readers. In this version, we find a God who commands entire massacres, destroying men, women, and children. This contrast between the God of love and the God of war raises a fundamental question. Are we talking about the same divine being? Or do these stories reveal a much deeper and more mysterious reality? Today, we are going to dive into a careful analysis of this duality. We will explore how God is portrayed in the Old and New Testaments and try to understand if these representations can be reconciled. The Christian tradition presents us with a God of love, but the Old Testament paints a very different picture in some respects. This challenges us to question how these images coexist and what they tell us about the nature of God. The idea of a God who both protects and destroys challenges conventional understanding. Many of us know the God who preaches forgiveness. But how do we understand the God who commands exterminations? The answer to this tension may not be simple. But before judging or concluding, it is necessary to understand the cultural and theological contexts that influenced these divine descriptions. In this video, we will address a series of Old Testament stories that illustrate this relentless side of God and contrast them with the message of love and redemption found in the New Testament. This journey may not offer definitive answers, but it will certainly open a path to deep reflections on the complexity of biblical divinity. If you're already curious, take the opportunity to like and comment. After all, who is the true God of the Bible? Our discussion begins with an overview of the Old Testament. We will see how Yahweh, the God of Israel, is described as a being of absolute power, often ruthless in his demands for justice. The starting point for this analysis will be the narrative of the conquest of Canaan, where Yahweh commands the total destruction of the city of Jericho in one of the most shocking episodes of Scripture. This event helps us understand the dimension of divine power and justice in ancient Hebrew theology. Throughout the biblical narrative, Yahweh appears as a God who makes covenants and demands total loyalty, but also does not hesitate to punish severely those who violate his will. This complexity is one reason why many find it difficult to reconcile the idea of a good God with the harsh realities described in the Old Testament. We will explore these episodes and their implications more deeply. While many Christians see Yahweh as the same God revealed in Jesus Christ, others, such as the ancient Gnostics, proposed that Yahweh could be a different deity from the Father revealed by Jesus. To these thinkers, the God of the Old Testament could not be the God of love and light, but rather a lesser and imperfect figure. This theological debate continues to intrigue scholars to this day. The goal of this video is not to provide definitive answers, but to stimulate reflection. How should we interpret these biblical passages? Are they literal or allegorical stories? And more importantly, what do they reveal to us about the nature of God? These questions will guide our investigation throughout the next chapters. So stay with us as we dive into this mystery. Now that we have an initial overview, it's time to go further and examine these stories more closely. We will explore the most controversial episodes of the Old Testament and discuss how they compare to the message of Jesus in the New Testament. Join us on this journey to discover a new way of understanding the Bible and the very nature of the divine. The God of the Old Testament. The Old Testament frequently describes Yahweh as a stern God who does not hesitate to use extreme force to protect his people or punish those who disobey him. To understand this representation, we must start with the central idea that Yahweh is a God of covenants. He makes a pact with Israel, promising protection and blessings in exchange for total obedience and faithfulness. However, this covenant is rigid. Those who break it face terrible consequences. One of the most notable examples is the conquest of Canaan, described in the book of Joshua. Yahweh commands the total destruction of the city of Jericho after its fall. Men, women, children, and even animals are exterminated, and everything is consecrated to Yahweh through destruction. This practice, known as herem, involved the complete annihilation of everything in God's name. This is one of the most disturbing episodes for modern readers who struggle to reconcile this kind of order with the idea of a compassionate God. Throughout the Old Testament, we see Yahweh demanding strict adherence to his commands and severely punishing any transgression. The idea of divine justice in the ancient biblical context is directly linked to the idea of survival. Israel, as the chosen nation, was constantly threatened by enemy peoples, and the orders for total destruction were meant to ensure Israel's purity and survival. But for contemporary readers, these accounts raise profound ethical questions. Divine violence in the Old Testament is also closely linked to the worldview of the ancient Near East, where wars and conflicts were frequent. Yahweh's role as a warrior God reflects this reality. Israel's survival, both physically and spiritually, depended on its ability to fight and conquer. Yahweh, in this sense, is a reflection of Israel's needs, a God who fights alongside his people to guarantee their victory. For many scholars, Yahweh's violence in the Old Testament can be understood as a reflection of the cultural and historical context of the time. However, this explanation does not resolve the spiritual dilemma faced by many readers who wonder how a God who preaches compassion can also command destruction. This is a crucial point that will be explored throughout our discussion. When we compare this image of Yahweh with the figure of Jesus in the New Testament, the differences are striking. While Yahweh is a God of war and punishment, Jesus is described as the Prince of Peace, preaching forgiveness and reconciliation. The question then arises, are we dealing with the same God? Or is there a radical transformation in the understanding of God between the two testaments? This tension led many thinkers, especially in early Christianity, to question the unity of the Bible as a text revealed by a single God. Groups like the Gnostics believed that Yahweh was, in fact, a lesser deity, the demiurge, who ruled the material world with an implacable sense of justice. To them, the true God revealed by Jesus was a superior being of pure light and compassion. The Gnostic view offers a radical interpretation of biblical texts, suggesting that Yahweh and the God of Jesus are two distinct beings. This idea, though considered heretical by the early church, continues to intrigue many modern scholars who seek to understand how to reconcile Yahweh's severity with Jesus' love. Regardless of how we interpret these differences, they point to a theological complexity that cannot be ignored. Ultimately, the God of the Old Testament challenges us to think about the nature of divine justice. He is, without a doubt, a God of covenant and protection, but this protection comes at a high cost for his enemies, and even for the Israelites themselves when they fail to follow his command. This image of God is both powerful and unsettling, forcing us to reflect on what divine justice truly means. Yahweh in the orders of destruction. In the Old Testament, Yahweh issues several commands for total destruction against Israel's enemy. One of the most striking examples is found in the book of 1 Samuel, when Yahweh commands King Saul to completely exterminate the Amalekites. Now go, attack the Amalekites, and devote to destruction all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. 1 Samuel 15:3. The order is clear and merciless. This command against the Amalekites raises deep ethical questions. Why would God demand the annihilation of an entire nation, including women, children, and even animals? The brutality of this command seems incompatible with the image of a God who values life. Many scholars point out that, in the worldview of the time, the Amalekites represented a constant threat to Israel's survival, and their total destruction was seen as a necessary measure to ensure the security of the chosen people. However, the fact that Yahweh demands the destruction of innocents such as children and animals, makes the issue even more troubling. Why exterminate those who theoretically had no responsibility for the sins of their parents? For some, this is an extreme example of Yahweh's retributive justice, which punishes not only the sinners, but their descendants as well. Divine justice, in this case, is severe and relentless, reflecting the worldview of the ancient Near East. Another interesting aspect of this episode is that Saul, the king of Israel, attempts to spare some of the animals and the Amalekite king himself. However, his decision is harshly condemned by the prophet Samuel, who reinforces the need for total obedience to Yahweh's commands. For Samuel, Saul's disobedience is not just a tactical failure, but a serious spiritual violation. Yahweh demands complete obedience without concessions. This episode illustrates the radical nature of Yahweh's justice in the Old Testament. There is no room for mercy or compromise. God's command must be fulfilled entirely, no matter how brutal it may seem. For the Israelites, such obedience was crucial for preserving their identity as the chosen people. But for modern readers, it raises uncomfortable moral question. The issue of divine justice and absolute obedience is one of the most challenging in the Old Testament. Yahweh does not allow for ambiguity in his commands. In Saul's case, his attempt to spare King Agag and the best animals for sacrifice resulted in his rejection as king. Samuel, acting on Yahweh's behalf, personally executes the Amalekite king to complete the divine order. This kind of justice, which requires the death of innocents and the literal fulfillment of destruction commands, seems to strongly contrast with the message of love and forgiveness found in the New Testament. Jesus, unlike Yahweh, preaches compassion and forgiveness even for enemies, something difficult to reconcile with the violent commands of the Old Testament. For the Gnostics, these discrepancies were proof that Yahweh and the God of Jesus could not be the same. They argued that Yahweh was an imperfect deity, ruling with an iron hand and demanding cruel sacrifices to maintain his dominion. To them, the true God, revealed by Jesus, was a superior being whose justice was not based on destruction and death, but on love and mercy. This radically different view of God challenges traditional theology, but offers an explanation for the tensions we see between the Old and New Testaments. What can we learn from these contrasts? Is there a way to reconcile these two images of God? Or are we dealing with two distinct beings, as the Gnostics suggest? The Gnostic Perspective. The Demiurge. The Gnostics, an early Christian sect, offered a radical perspective on Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament. For them, Yahweh was not the true God, but rather the Demiurge, a lesser and imperfect deity who created the material world. This view directly challenged traditional Judeo-Christian theology, which regarded Yahweh as the supreme creator and the same God who sent Jesus Christ into the world. In Gnostic cosmology, the Demiurge was an ignorant being who, unaware of the existence of the true God, created the material universe from his own imperfection. This creation was seen as a prison for human souls, trapped in material bodies and subject to suffering, death, and corruption. For the Gnostics, matter itself was corrupt, and the goal of spiritual life was to escape the cycle of reincarnation and the material prison created by the Demiurge. Yahweh, in this context, was seen as a tyrannical ruler who controlled the material world through rigid laws and severe punishment. His obsession with control and retributive justice was interpreted by the Gnostics as a reflection of his own limitation. They viewed Yahweh as a lesser God, blind to the existence of the true transcendent God, and bound by his own desire for power and domination over the material cosmos. This view of the Demiurge explained, for the Gnostics, why Yahweh was so harsh and relentless in his commands for destruction and sacrifice. He was not the God of love and light revealed by Jesus, but rather an inferior being whose actions reflected his own flawed nature. For them, the true God existed beyond the material world, in a spiritual realm of light and perfection, and Jesus came into the world to free human souls from the prison created by the Demiurge. The Gnostics believed that Jesus was not the Son of Yahweh, but an emissary of the true God. His mission was not to continue Yahweh's plan, but to challenge it. Jesus brought spiritual knowledge, or gnosis, that allowed people to perceive the truth about their existence and escape the control of the Demiurge. For the Gnostics, Jesus' message was one of liberation, not submission to Yahweh's laws. This Gnostic view of Yahweh as the Demiurge is radically different from traditional Christian theology, which sees God as a single benevolent entity in both the Old and New Testaments. However, for the Gnostics, the difference between the God of the Old Testament and the God of Jesus was so great that they could not accept them as the same being. Yahweh was viewed as a God of war and destruction, while Jesus represented light and forgiveness. This dichotomy was also reflected in Jesus' actions in the New Testament. While Yahweh demanded sacrifices and strict obedience to the law, Jesus preached forgiveness and challenged the religious norms of his time. The Sermon on the Mount, for instance, where Jesus says, "Love your enemies," Matthew 5:44, directly contrasts with the Old Testament's retributive laws, such as an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, Exodus 21:24. For the Gnostics, this difference was not just a theological evolution, but a total rupture with Yahweh's system of justice. They believed that Jesus came to reveal the truth about the nature of the universe and to show people that the God they worship in the Old Testament was not the true God. The true God, according to the Gnostics, did not demand blood sacrifices or strict adherence to laws, but offered liberation and spiritual knowledge. This Gnostic view had a strong influence in the early centuries of Christianity, but it was eventually branded as heresy by the institutional church. However, the question they raised, whether Yahweh and the God of Jesus were the same being, continues to challenge scholars and theologians to this day. Does the God of the Old Testament truly reflect the divine nature? Or are we dealing with a cultural and temporal representation of a lower power, as the Gnostics suggested? Jesus as the liberator from Yahweh's system. For the Gnostics, Jesus was far more than a prophet or the Son of Yahweh. He was the liberator who came to break the oppressive system created by the Demiurge. While traditional Christian theology views Jesus as the fulfillment of the promises made by Yahweh, the Gnostics believed that he came to undo the chains Yahweh had imposed on humanity through his laws and rituals. This perspective presents a radically different view of Jesus' mission, one in which he not only redeems humanity, but frees it from the very divine system of control. According to this Gnostic interpretation, Jesus' message was one of spiritual liberation. He did not come merely to save sinners from Yahweh's wrath, but to reveal that Yahweh was not the true God. Jesus brought a new understanding of spiritual reality to the world, showing that the material universe, governed by Yahweh's rigid laws, was nothing more than a prison for divine soul. The true goal of life was to transcend the physical world and reconnect with the transcendent God. This idea of liberation is evident in various passages of the Gospels. In the Sermon on the Mount, for instance, Jesus directly challenges Yahweh's established laws of retaliation when he says, "You have heard that it was said, 'Eye for eye, and tooth for tooth.' But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also." Matthew 5. Another central aspect of Jesus' mission, according to the Gnostics, is his criticism of established religious structures. In the Gospel of John, we see Jesus driving out the money changers from the temple, an action that symbolizes his rejection of the sacrificial system that defined worship of Yahweh. For the Gnostics, this was more than an act of religious purification. It was an attack on the spiritual control system that Yahweh had imposed on Israel. Moreover, the crucifixion of Jesus holds special significance for the Gnostic. They believed that his death on the cross was not a sacrifice to appease Yahweh's wrath, but an act of spiritual liberation. By dying, Jesus broke the chains that bound humanity to the material world and opened the way for human souls to escape the prison of the body and reconnect with the true God. For the Gnostics, Jesus' resurrection was not just proof of his divinity, but a demonstration that the Demiurge's power over the material world had been defeated. For the Gnostics, Jesus did not come to reinforce Yahweh's laws or demand sacrifices. He came to show that true divine justice was not based on retribution, but on forgiveness. This is evident in many of his actions and teachings. When Jesus forgives the adulterous woman in John 8, he challenges the literal application of Mosaic law, which demanded her death by stoning, by saying, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." John 8:7. Jesus subverts Yahweh's punitive logic and offers a new form of justice based on mercy. This break with Yahweh's system is one reason why the Gnostics saw Jesus as an emissary of the true God, rather than Yahweh's son. They believed that the God revealed by Jesus was completely different from the one described in the Old Testament. While Yahweh demanded blind obedience and punishment for sinners, Jesus offered freedom and spiritual knowledge. According to the Gnostics, Jesus' message was one of cosmic liberation. He was not merely offering forgiveness for sins committed under Yahweh's law, but revealing that this very law was a form of oppression. By following Jesus, people could escape the cycle of punishment and sacrifice that had defined Israel's relationship with Yahweh and discover a new spiritual life based on love and light. This vision of Jesus as the liberator from Yahweh's system is one of the most controversial aspects of Gnostic theology, but also one of the most powerful. It provides an explanation for the stark contrast between Yahweh's punitive justice and Jesus' mercy. And it positions Jesus as a revolutionary figure who came to completely transform humanity's relationship with the divine. The Law of Moses versus the message of Jesus. The Law of Moses, established in the Old Testament, and the message of Jesus in the New Testament represent two of the most striking contrasts in the Bible. While Mosaic law is rigid, punitive, and focused on sacrifices, Jesus' message offers a completely different approach, centered on grace, forgiveness, and unconditional love. This contrast not only redefines Christian spirituality, but also raises profound questions about the continuity between the Old and New Testaments. The Law of Moses consists of hundreds of commandments covering every aspect of Israelite life, from worshiping God to daily practices of justice and hygiene. In Leviticus 16, for example, we find the ritual of the Day of Atonement, where animal sacrifices are offered to atone for the sins of the people. This sacrificial system was at the heart of worshiping Yahweh, and divine justice was often achieved through the death of a substitute. However, Jesus' message in the New Testament proposes a new form of justice, one that no longer depends on blood sacrifices or strict adherence to a list of commandments. In Matthew 5:17, Jesus states, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." For many, this means that Jesus reaffirmed the validity of the Mosaic law. But throughout his ministry, he frequently challenges the literal application of the law. A clear example of this rupture is seen in the episode of the adulterous woman, where, according to Mosaic law, she should have been stoned to death. However, Jesus not only spares her, but also condemns those who were ready to carry out the punishment by saying, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." John 8:7. Here, we see a radical shift. Instead of punitive justice, Jesus offers forgiveness and mercy. This tension between Yahweh's punitive justice and Jesus' message of forgiveness is central to understanding the contrast between the Old and New Testaments. While the law of Moses demanded constant sacrifices to atone for sins, Jesus presents himself as the final and definitive sacrifice. His death on the cross eliminates the need for further blood sacrifices, inaugurating a new era of reconciliation between God and humanity. The Gnostics viewed this change as evidence that Jesus was, in fact, dismantling Yahweh's system. They believed that the system of laws and sacrifices in the Old Testament was a form of control imposed on humanity by the demiurge. For the Gnostics, Jesus did not come to fulfill these laws, but to liberate people from them, offering a new way of spiritual life that transcended the material world. Jesus' message, then, can be seen as a break with the punitive logic of the Mosaic Law. While Yahweh demanded sacrifices to atone for sin, Jesus offers unconditional grace and forgiveness. This new kind of justice, based on love and mercy, is radically different from the retributive justice of the Old Testament and represents a profound transformation in the relationship between God and humanity. Moreover, Jesus frequently challenges the religious authorities who defended the strict application of Mosaic law. In Matthew 23, for instance, he criticizes the Pharisees for their hypocrisy, saying that they focus on external aspects of the law but ignore justice, mercy, and faithfulness. For Jesus, true justice is not found in the strict observance of rules, but in the heart of the person and their ability to forgive and love. This fundamental difference between the law of Moses and Jesus' message is one of the most important points in Christian theology, and also one of the hardest to reconcile with the traditional view of a single, unified God. The Gnostics, however, believed that this difference was proof that Yahweh and Jesus could not be the same God. Yahweh ruled with an iron hand, demanding obedience and sacrifice, while Jesus brought a message of freedom and love. The tension between these two visions of justice, Yahweh's retributive justice and Jesus' restorative justice, remains one of the greatest challenges in interpreting the Bible. For the Gnostics, Jesus came to free humanity from Yahweh's oppressive system, and his message of grace and forgiveness represented a new way to relate to the divine. But this interpretation, while fascinating, raises deep questions about the very nature of God, judgment and punishment in the Old and New Testaments. The way judgment and punishment are addressed in the Old and New Testaments is one of the most striking contrasts between the two parts of the Bible. In the Old Testament, Yahweh exercises justice immediately and physically, often using catastrophes and destruction to punish those who disobey him. In the New Testament, however, Jesus presents a different view of judgment, focusing more on the spiritual dimension and the eternal fate of the soul, rather than physical punishment. In the Old Testament, Yahweh is depicted as a God who acts severely against those who violate his laws. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is a classic example. These cities are completely annihilated by fire and brimstone as punishment for their sins, in a collective judgment that does not distinguish between guilty and innocent. This type of divine justice is physical and catastrophic, reflecting the idea that Yahweh governs the world with a sense of justice that demands immediate retribution. Another notable example is the flood in the time of Noah, where Yahweh decides to wipe out all of humanity, except for Noah and his family, due to widespread corruption on earth. This episode is an extreme example of divine judgment, where the entire creation is destroyed as punishment for humanity's sins. Yahweh's justice in the Old Testament is often relentless and involves the destruction of entire nations, leaving little room for repentance or mercy. In contrast, in the New Testament, judgment takes on a very different form. Jesus speaks of the final judgment, where souls will be separated between the righteous and the wicked. But this judgment does not occur in the physical world. It takes place in the spiritual realm. In Matthew 25, in the parable of the sheep and the goats, Jesus describes how the righteous will be rewarded with eternal life, while the wicked will be cast into eternal fire. Here, divine justice is more focused on the eternal destiny of the soul rather than immediate physical punishment. For the Gnostics, this difference between Yahweh's judgment and Jesus' judgment was clear evidence that they could not be the same being. Yahweh governed the material world with physical punishments and destruction, while Jesus offered spiritual justice based on love and repentance. For the Gnostics, Yahweh's physical judgment was a way to keep humanity trapped in the material world, while Jesus offered a way to escape that prison and reach the spiritual realm. The Gnostics also interpreted the concept of hell differently. For them, the eternal fire mentioned by Jesus was not a place of physical torment, but a metaphor for the spiritual separation from the true God. They believed that hell was, in fact, the continuation of existence in the material world, governed by the demiurge, while true paradise was spiritual liberation and reconnection with the transcendent God. This view of judgment and punishment is also reflected in the resurrection of Jesus. For the Gnostics, the resurrection was not just proof that Jesus was the Son of God, but a demonstration that the power of the material world, and by extension Yahweh, had been defeated. By overcoming death, Jesus showed that the cycle of birth, death, and reincarnation imposed by the demiurge could be broken, offering human souls a way out to the spiritual realm. The difference between Yahweh's physical judgment and Jesus' spiritual judgment raises profound questions about the nature of divine justice. For the Gnostics, Yahweh's justice was imperfect and based on material control, while Jesus' justice was perfect and spiritual. They saw Jesus as an emissary of the true God, who came to free humanity from the cycle of punishment and suffering imposed by Yahweh. This Gnostic interpretation of judgment and punishment in the Old and New Testaments provides a new perspective on the differences between Yahweh and Jesus. While Yahweh ruled with severe punishments and destruction, Jesus brought a message of mercy and forgiveness, offering people the opportunity to escape material control and reconnect with the transcendent God. The exclusivity of Israel in the Old Testament. One of the fundamental characteristics of Yahweh in the Old Testament is his exclusive relationship with Israel, regarded as the chosen people. Yahweh establishes a covenant with Abraham and his descendants, promising them protection, blessings, and their own land, provided they follow his laws and worship him alone. This relationship creates a national identity where Israel is viewed as separate and superior to other nations, reinforcing the idea of a partial God focused on a specific group. In Deuteronomy 7:6, Yahweh says to the people of Israel, "For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the face of the earth to be his people, his treasured possession." This verse demonstrates the exclusive nature of Yahweh's covenant with Israel. For the Israelites, this divine election was a source of pride and a guarantee of protection. But it also came with the strict requirement to follow the Mosaic law, with severe consequences for disobedience. This covenant between Yahweh and Israel also involved the destruction of other nations. In the books of Deuteronomy and Joshua, Yahweh commands Israel to conquer the land of Canaan and completely eliminate the peoples who live there. The command to destroy entire cities and enemy nations reinforces the exclusive nature of the covenant, where Yahweh protects Israel while annihilating those who threaten its purity or prosperity. These actions reflect a worldview where Israel's survival and holiness depend on the destruction of its enemies. The exclusive relationship between Yahweh and Israel is also evident in the system of laws and rituals the Israelites must follow to remain in communion with God. The Mosaic law prohibits Israel from adopting the customs and practices of neighboring peoples, reinforcing the idea of separation. Yahweh demands that Israel remain pure, both physically and spiritually, rejecting any foreign influence. Cultural and religious isolation was a key part of Israel's identity as Yahweh's chosen people. However, in the New Testament, Jesus' message breaks with this exclusivity. Jesus does not limit his mission to the Jews. Instead, he preaches to Samaritans, Gentiles, and even Romans. In Matthew 28:19, after his resurrection, he gives the Great Commission to his disciples. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations. This command reflects a significant shift in the vision of God. The plan of salvation is no longer exclusive to Israel, but is offered to all nations and peoples. The inclusion of the Gentiles in the plan of salvation was one of the most controversial points in the early church. In Acts 15, we see the Council of Jerusalem, where the apostles debated whether Gentile converts to Christianity should follow the Mosaic Law. Final decision, led by Peter and Paul, was that salvation through faith in Jesus did not require adherence to Jewish law. This was a pivotal moment, marking the opening of Christianity to the Gentile world and the transition from an exclusive religion to a universal faith. For the Gnostics, this universal opening was further evidence that the God revealed by Jesus was different from Yahweh. They saw Yahweh as a tribal deity, focused solely on Israel, while the true God revealed by Jesus was universal and transcendent. Yahweh's exclusivity, with its demands for sacrifices and ritual obedience, was viewed as a reflection of his imperfect and limited nature. The true God, according to the Gnostics, did not concern himself with nations or rituals, but with the spiritual liberation of all human souls. This universal inclusion also reflects the contrast between the Mosaic Law and Jesus' message. While the Mosaic Law was restricted to Israel and reinforced the separation between Jews and Gentiles, Jesus' message crosses these barriers. In Galatians 3:28, Paul declares, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." This verse symbolizes the unity and universality of the Christian message, where the distinctions imposed by Yahweh are transcended. The transition from Israel's exclusivity to the inclusion of all nations represents a profound transformation in biblical theology. While the Old Testament presents a God who protects and guides only a specific group, the New Testament reveals a God who cares for all humanity. This shift not only redefined Israel's role in the divine plan, but also opened the doors for the global spread of Christianity. For the Gnostics, this transition was proof that Yahweh and the God of Jesus could not be the same. The tribal and exclusive God of the Old Testament did not align with Jesus' universal message of love and liberation. Instead of following the laws of a God who protected only Israel, the Gnostics believed that Jesus was revealing a superior God who transcended national boundaries and offered salvation to all souls. This vision continues to provoke theological reflection to this day. The sacrifice of Jesus, a new meaning. The sacrifice of Jesus on the cross is central to Christian theology, and its significance goes far beyond the simple atonement of sins. In the Old Testament, animal sacrifices were regularly required to atone for the sins of the people of Israel. For example, in Leviticus 16, we find the ritual of the Day of Atonement, where the high priest sacrifices an animal on behalf of the entire nation. The sacrificial system was an integral part of the covenant between Yahweh and Israel, symbolizing divine justice, which demanded blood for purification. However, the sacrifice of Jesus in the New Testament brings a radical shift to this system. Instead of repeated annual sacrifices, Jesus offers himself as the perfect and final sacrifice, eliminating the need for future offerings. As stated in Hebrews 9:12, Jesus entered the most holy place once for all, not by the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood, thus securing eternal redemption. This marks the end of Yahweh's sacrificial system and the beginning of a new era of grace. For the Gnostics, Jesus' sacrifice was not just a continuation of Yahweh's plan, but a complete rupture with it. They saw the Old Testament sacrificial system as a form of control that the demiurge, Yahweh, had imposed on humanity. Yahweh required blood sacrifices and strict obedience to laws to maintain his authority over the material world. But by dying on the cross, Jesus was not simply fulfilling this law. He was challenging and transcending Yahweh's retributive justice system. The crucifixion, for the Gnostics, was an act of cosmic liberation. Jesus' death symbolized the defeat of the demiurge's power over the material world and over human souls. The tearing of the temple veil at the moment of Jesus' death is seen as a symbol of the destruction of the barriers between the material and spiritual world. For the Gnostics, Jesus was breaking the cycle of sacrifice and punishment that Yahweh had established, opening the way for souls to escape the prison of the body and reconnect with the true God. This Gnostic understanding of Jesus' sacrifice is also reflected in the resurrection. For them, the resurrection was not just proof of Jesus' divinity, but a demonstration that the power of death and the material world had been defeated. By rising from the dead, Jesus showed that the cycle of birth, death, and reincarnation imposed by the demiurge could be broken. The resurrection, therefore, was a victory over the power of the physical world, offering human souls a path to escape this reality and reach the spiritual realm. This interpretation of Jesus' sacrifice as an act of spiritual liberation is also reflected in his message of forgiveness. While Yahweh demanded retributive justice, where sins were paid for with sacrifices and punishments, Jesus offered unconditional grace and forgiveness. Even on the cross, Jesus cried out for the forgiveness of his enemies. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing," Luke 23:34. This act of forgiveness directly contrasted with Yahweh's severe justice, which required payment for sin. For the Gnostics, this difference in Jesus' approach was not merely a matter of mercy, but a sign that he was rejecting Yahweh's system of justice. Jesus was not asking his followers to continue with the sacrifices and laws of Moses. He was offering a new way to relate to God, one based on love, spiritual knowledge, and liberation. This was a complete break with the control system that the demiurge had established. The sacrifice of Jesus, then, has profound and multifaceted meaning. It marks the end of the cycle of sacrifices and the beginning of a new era of grace. But for the Gnostics, it also represents the liberation of human souls from Yahweh's dominion and the material world. By sacrificing himself, Jesus opened the doors for people to transcend physical reality and reconnect with the true God, who did not demand blood sacrifices, but sought spiritual knowledge and truth. This understanding of Jesus' sacrifice as an act of cosmic liberation is one of the most powerful ideas in Gnostic theology. It not only challenges the traditional Christian view, but also offers a new way of thinking about the relationship between humanity and the divine. For the Gnostics, Jesus did not come to reaffirm Yahweh's laws, but to free humanity from them, offering a new era of spiritual enlightenment. Creation in the Old and New Testaments. The narrative of creation in the Old and New Testaments offers another crucial perspective on the difference between Yahweh and the God revealed by Jesus. In the Old Testament, Yahweh is described as the creator of the material world, a universe he forms out of chaos and over which he imposes his order. In Genesis 1:2, we read, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the deep." Yahweh then begins to separate and organize this chaos, creating light, land, seas, and all forms of life. However, this creation is described in terms of control and subjugation. Yahweh separates commands and orders, a universe that initially appears chaotic. He creates humanity in his image, but also subjects them to a set of laws and limits, as seen in the story of Adam and Eve, where the transgression of Yahweh's command leads to humanity's fall. This concept of creation is rooted in power and control, where Yahweh is both the lawgiver and the judge. In contrast, the New Testament presents a different vision of creation. In John 1:1 thread, we read, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made." Here, creation is portrayed as an act of the Logos, Word, who is identified with Jesus. This creation is more harmonious and spiritual, where the world is formed through divine wisdom, rather than in conflict with primordial chaos. For the Gnostics, this difference between the creation narratives revealed the existence of two distinct creative principles. Yahweh, the Demiurge, created the material world out of his ignorance and arrogance, and his creation reflected this imperfection. The physical universe, with its pain, suffering, and limitations, was seen by the Gnostics as a prison for human souls. Matter was corrupt and imperfect, and the goal of spiritual life was to escape this material creation. In contrast, the God revealed by Jesus was not the creator of the material world. He was the creator of a superior spiritual realm where light, peace, and perfection reigned. The true God's creation did not involve corrupt matter. It was spiritual and eternally. For the Gnostics, Jesus' mission was to free human souls from Yahweh's imperfect creation and show the way to this superior, immaterial creation. This Gnostic view of creation also influenced their understanding of the human body. The body, as part of Yahweh's material creation, was seen as a prison for the divine soul. The Gnostics believed that the human soul had a celestial origin, but was trapped in the physical body, subject to suffering, death, and decay. The liberation of the soul depended on rejecting the material world and pursuing spiritual knowledge, or gnosis, which would enable the soul to escape the confines of the body. For the Gnostics, Jesus' resurrection was proof that the power of matter had been defeated. By overcoming death, Jesus showed that the physical world had no power over souls that had attained spiritual knowledge. The resurrection was not just a triumph over physical death, but a break from the cycle of birth and death imposed by the Demiurge. By rising from the dead, Jesus opened the path for human souls to escape Yahweh's dominion and return to the spiritual realm. The difference between Yahweh's creation and the creation of the God revealed by Jesus, therefore, reflects the fundamental difference in their natures. Yahweh creates an imperfect material world filled with suffering, while the true God creates a perfect and eternal spiritual reality. For the Gnostics, the physical world was a distortion of the true divine creation, and Jesus' role was to reveal this truth and show the path to liberation. This Gnostic understanding of creation also challenges the traditional Judeo-Christian theology, which views Yahweh as the sole creator. For the Gnostics, Yahweh's creation was limited and imperfect, while the true God's creation transcended the material world and manifested in the spiritual realm. The physical universe, with all its laws and limitations, was merely a shadow of the true spiritual reality, where the true God reigned in perfect harmony. This distinction between Yahweh's material creation and the true God's spiritual creation is fundamental to understanding Gnostic cosmology. The ultimate goal of life for the Gnostics was not to improve or redeem the material world, but to escape it. Yahweh's creation, with its limitations and suffering, was not the true home of human soul. The true destiny of the soul was to return to the light and perfection of the spiritual realm. And Jesus' mission was to guide people on this path back to the true creation, reconciling the Old and New Testaments. After exploring the image of God in the Old and New Testaments, a fundamental question remains: are we dealing with the same divine being, or do these narratives reveal completely different realities? The image of Yahweh in the Old Testament with his severe justice and commands for destruction, seems irreconcilable with the message of love and forgiveness preached by Jesus in the New Testament. This tension has led many thinkers, both in the past and present, to question whether Yahweh and the God of Jesus can really be the same entity. The Gnostics, as we've seen, believed that Yahweh was the demiurge, a lesser and imperfect deity responsible for the creation of the material world and the rigid laws that governed Israel. For them, the true God, revealed by Jesus, was a transcendent being whose justice was based on love, forgiveness, and spiritual liberation. This view offers a way to resolve the apparent contradiction between the Old and New Testaments by suggesting that we are, in fact, dealing with two distinct gods. However, traditional Christianity holds that both Yahweh and Jesus are expressions of the same God, whose revelation unfolds over time. In this interpretation, Yahweh's actions in the Old Testament, though harsh, are part of a larger plan that culminates in the coming of Jesus and the offer of salvation to all humanity. Yahweh's severe justice in the Old Testament is understood as necessary to preserve the people of Israel and prepare the way for the final revelation of Jesus. This tension between the Old and New Testaments remains one of the greatest challenges for theologians and biblical scholars. Regardless of how we interpret these differences, the fact is that the Bible presents us with a complex and multifaceted image of God, which can be difficult to reconcile. What we can learn from these tensions is that the understanding of God is something that evolves, both in the Scriptures and in theological interpretations over the centuries. Ultimately, how we interpret these differences between Yahweh and Jesus depends greatly on our theological perspective. If we believe in one unchanging God, then Yahweh's actions must be seen as part of a larger and more mysterious plan that is only fully revealed with the coming of Jesus. On the other hand, if we subscribe to the Gnostic view, we might understand Yahweh and Jesus as representing two distinct beings with radically different views on justice, love, and power. This is the mystery that drives us to continue exploring and reflecting. And you, what do you think? Are we dealing with the same God, or with two completely different divine realities? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more deep discussions like this. See you in the next video.